May 8, 1945. Berlin is burning. Soviet artillery pounds the ruins of Hitler's capital into dust. Nazi officers are torching documents, swallowing cyanide capsules, putting bullets in their own heads. The war is over. The Third Reich has fallen. But in the chaos of those final hours, one man slips through the cracks. General Heinrich Müller, architect of some of the regime's darkest operations, vanishes without a trace. For 80 years, historians assumed he died in the rubble or fled to South America like so many others. Then, a documentary crew stumbled onto something in the Argentine wilderness, a compound hidden so deep in the Andes that satellites never picked it up. What they found inside didn't just rewrite Müller's story. It exposed a network that had been operating in plain sight for 8 decades. The man who disappeared that spring night in 1945 wasn't some minor functionary. Heinrich Müller commanded the Gestapo's Foreign Intelligence Division. He knew every secret, every escape route, every collaborator across 3 continents. When the Soviets closed their noose around Berlin, dozens of high-ranking Nazis chose suicide over capture. Müller didn't. His office was found abandoned on May 1st. Coffee still warm in the cup, maps spread across the desk, a half-written memo about partisan activity in Yugoslavia. Then, nothing. No body, no witness accounts, no paper trail. The Western Allies searched for him for years. The Soviets claimed they'd never found him either, though their records from that period are notoriously unreliable. By 1950, most intelligence agencies had written him off as dead, probably buried in some unmarked mass grave with thousands of other casualties from Berlin's final battle. Except Müller had spent 4 years preparing for this exact moment. While other Nazi leaders still believed in some miraculous reversal of fortune, Müller was a realist. He'd seen the intelligence reports. He knew the war was lost by late 1944, maybe earlier. And he'd done what he did best. He planned. Documents declassified in the 1990s revealed something fascinating. Starting in early 1944, the Gestapo moved significant gold reserves out of Germany through a series of intermediaries: art, cash, industrial diamonds. All of it flowing through neutral countries into South America. The official explanation was that these were contingency funds for continuing resistance operations after a German defeat. But the amounts were staggering. Estimates range from $400 million to over $1 billion in today's currency. Far too much for a guerrilla movement. Someone was building infrastructure for the long term. Argentina was the obvious destination. President Juan Perón had maintained friendly relations with the Axis throughout the war. His government issued thousands of identity documents to Europeans fleeing the continent, asking very few questions about their backgrounds. By 1948, Buenos Aires had become a magnet for former SS officers, Wehrmacht generals, and functionaries from every level of the Nazi hierarchy. They lived openly in German-speaking neighborhoods, ran businesses, sent their children to German-language schools. The Argentine government knew exactly who they were. They didn't care. But Müller wasn't like the others. The beer hall crowd in Buenos Aires loved to reminisce about the old days, wear their medals at private gatherings, plot imaginary comebacks. Müller had always been different, cold, methodical, paranoid about security. If he made it to Argentina, he wouldn't be living in some comfortable suburb telling war stories. He'd disappear completely. The first hint that something unusual was happening came in 1978. A German journalist named Klaus Fischer was researching a book on Nazi escape routes when he interviewed an elderly man in Bariloche, a resort town in the Argentine Andes. The man, who refused to give his name, mentioned a German community deep in the mountains. Not the well-known German settlements around Bariloche itself, but something else. A place where certain people went when they needed to vanish permanently. Fischer tried to follow up, but his source died 2 weeks later. Heart attack, according to the death certificate. Fisher spent 6 months trying to verify the story, driving dirt roads into the mountains, talking to locals. He found nothing. Eventually, he moved on to other projects. 3 decades later, another lead surfaced. An Argentine environmental group was using drone footage to document illegal logging in Neuquén province when they noticed something odd. A valley that satellite imagery showed as empty forest had structures in it, not indigenous ruins or abandoned settlements. Buildings with right angles, metal roofs, what looked like a perimeter fence. When they tried to access the area on foot, they found the roads blocked by private security. No signs, no explanation, just armed men who politely but firmly turned them back. The environmental group reported it to authorities, assuming it was some kind of illegal mining operation. The complaint went nowhere. Someone with serious connections wanted that valley left alone. Then, in 2023, a documentary filmmaker named Sofia Reyes got a tip from an unexpected source. Her grandfather had been a truck driver in Neuquén in the 1950s and 60s. Before he died, he told her about deliveries he'd made to a compound in the mountains, German clients, who paid in cash and never gave names. He'd assumed they were just wealthy eccentrics, maybe former Nazis lying low. But one detail stuck with him. On his last delivery in 1967, he'd glimpsed an older man through a window. The man was in a wheelchair, clearly in poor health. But the way everyone deferred to him, the security around his room, suggested he was someone important. Sofia's grandfather never thought much about it until decades later when he saw a documentary about Nazi hunters. There was a photograph of Heinrich Müller, same sharp features, same cold eyes. He couldn't be certain, but the resemblance was striking. Sofia spent 2 years planning her approach. Getting into that valley wouldn't be easy. The security presence had actually increased over the years, but she had advantages the environmental activists didn't. Her cousin worked for a surveying company that had contracts throughout Neuquén. Through him, she obtained topographical maps that showed service roads not visible on standard charts. More importantly, she connected with a former security contractor who'd worked at the compound in the early 2000s. He wouldn't go on camera, wouldn't even give his real name, but over encrypted messages, he provided crucial information. The compound had been built in stages starting in the late 1940s. It was maintained by a trust based in Liechtenstein with layers of shell companies obscuring the real ownership. And it was still occupied. That last detail changed everything. Sofia had assumed she'd be documenting an abandoned relic, maybe finding some documents or artifacts left behind. But an active compound meant people who didn't want to be found. It meant risk. Her crew debated walking away. This wasn't what they'd signed up for, but the story was too important. If Müller had survived, if he'd built some kind of refuge that was still operating 80 years later, the world needed to know. They assembled a small team, 4 people total. They'd approach from the eastern ridge, a route the former contractor said was less monitored. They'd use long-range cameras, stay hidden, document whatever they could see. No confrontations, no trespassing, just observation. What they saw through those telephoto lenses over 3 days of surveillance was bizarre. The compound was immaculate. Buildings that had to be 70 years old looked freshly painted. Gardens were manicured. Solar panels covered several roofs, a modern addition to an otherwise period-appropriate aesthetic. And there were people. Not many, maybe a dozen visible over the course of their observation. Mostly elderly, moving slowly between buildings, but also younger individuals. Security, obviously, and others whose role wasn't immediately clear. Staff, maybe, or something else. On the 3rd day, Sofia's camera operator caught something that made everyone freeze. An old man being pushed in a wheelchair across a courtyard. He looked ancient, skin like parchment, clearly near the end of his life. But the deference shown by everyone around him was unmistakable. They weren't just helping an elderly resident, they were attending to someone important, someone who still commanded authority despite his obvious frailty. Sophia zoomed in as far as her lens would allow. The image was grainy, shot from nearly a kilometer away, but the bone structure was there, the shape of the skull, the set of the eyes. She pulled up the reference photos she'd brought. Heinrich Müller in 1944, clean-shaven and severe in his SS uniform. The man in the wheelchair was 80 years older, ravaged by time. But the resemblance was undeniable. They had found him, or someone who looked exactly like him. The implications were staggering. If this was Müller, he'd lived to at least 103 years old, hidden in the Argentine mountains while the world assumed he was dead. But why? What had he been doing all these decades? And who were these people maintaining his compound, protecting his secrets, ensuring his survival into extreme old age? The answers to those questions would prove far more disturbing than anyone could have anticipated. Sophia's hands trembled as she lowered the camera. They'd come looking for evidence of a historical mystery. What they'd found was something actively being concealed, something worth protecting with security, isolation, and decades of careful planning. The team retreated to their base camp 5 kilometers away. That night, huddled around encrypted laptops, they debated their next move. The journalist in Sofia wanted to publish immediately. Get the photos out, force the story into the open before anyone could stop them. But her producer, Marcus, urged caution. "We have photos of an old man in a wheelchair," he said. "That's it. No positive ID, no documents, nothing that proves who he actually is." He was right. The resemblance was striking, but resemblance wasn't proof. They needed more. They needed to get inside. The former contractor had warned them about the security system, motion sensors on all approaches, cameras covering every entrance, guards who rotated on unpredictable schedules. The compound wasn't just protected. It was designed to remain invisible to anyone who didn't already know it existed. But there was one vulnerability. The compound's water supply came from a mountain spring 2 kilometers uphill. A pipeline ran underground, but there was a maintenance access point hidden in the rocks. The contractor had worked on repairs there years ago. If it hadn't been upgraded, it might be unwatched. Sophia made the decision. She'd go alone. Smaller footprint, less risk to the crew. If something went wrong, the others could get the existing footage out. Marcus argued, but she was the director. Her call. 2 nights later, she hiked to the access point under a moonless sky. The maintenance hatch was exactly where the contractor said it would be, camouflaged by carefully placed stones. She pried it open, expecting alarms, lights, something. Nothing happened. The tunnel was narrow, carved through rock, and lined with pipes that hummed with water pressure. She crawled for what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes. The tunnel sloped downward, and she could hear sounds ahead. Ventilation systems, machinery, human voices. She emerged in a mechanical room, all concrete and exposed pipes, empty. Security camera in the corner, but its lens was pointed at the main door, not the water access. An oversight, or maybe they'd never imagined anyone would find that tunnel. Sophia moved quickly, following the building's layout from the aerial photos they'd studied. She needed the administrative building. That's where records would be kept. That's where she'd find proof. The compound at night was eerily quiet. Lights burned in a few windows, but the pathways were deserted. She stayed in the shadows, moving between buildings, her heart hammering against her ribs. The administrative building's rear door was locked, but it was an old lock. She'd brought tools. 40 seconds of fumbling, and she was inside. The interior was like stepping into a time capsule. Wood-paneled walls, vintage furniture that belonged in a 1950s government office. Filing cabinets lined one wall, each drawer labeled in German. She started photographing labels, pulling folders at random. Financial records, maintenance logs, correspondence with lawyers in Buenos Aires, Zurich, Luxembourg. Shell companies transferring money, maintaining the property, paying staff, A bureaucracy dedicated to keeping this place running. Then she found the personnel files. The first folder she opened contained a photograph that made her blood run cold. Heinrich Müller, dated 1952. Older than the wartime photos, but unmistakably the same man. The file listed his arrival date as November 1948. It documented medical checkups, dietary requirements, security protocols. There were other files too. Names she recognized from history books. Mid-level Nazi officials who'd supposedly died or disappeared. Each folder contained similar documentation. Arrival dates in the late 1940s. Medical records stretching across decades. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a sanctuary. A refuge where war criminals had lived out their lives, protected by money and secrecy. But the most disturbing discovery was in a locked drawer she had to force open. A folder labeled simply Succession Protocol. The documents inside outlined a plan that defied belief. As the original residents aged and died, their resources would be consolidated. The compound would continue, maintained by descendants and loyal staff. Knowledge would be preserved. The ideological mission would persist. There were names of children and grandchildren, people born in Argentina, educated in Europe, now scattered across the world, some in business, some in politics. All maintaining connections to this place, this legacy. Sophia was photographing the succession documents when she heard footsteps in the hallway. She froze. The footsteps stopped outside the office door. A key rattled in the lock. She barely made it to the closet before the door opened. Through the slats, she watched an elderly woman enter, moving slowly but purposefully. The woman went straight to the filing cabinet Sophia had been examining. She pulled out a folder, flipped through it, then paused. The woman's eyes went to the floor, to the drawer Sophia had forced open, still slightly ajar. For a long moment, the woman just stood there. Then she spoke, not turning around, her German accented but clear. "You can come out. I know you're there." Sophia's mind raced. Run? Impossible. The woman was blocking the only exit. Fight? She'd come to document, not to hurt anyone. She stepped out of the closet, hands raised. The woman looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite anger, more like resignation. "You're the filmmaker," she said. "We've been watching your camp for days. We knew you'd try eventually. Then why let me get this far?" The woman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Because it doesn't matter. You can photograph all the files you want. You can publish your documentary. No one will care. People will care that Heinrich Müller lived until he died 3 months ago," the woman interrupted. "At 103 years old, the man you saw in the wheelchair was his grandson. We knew you'd assume it was him. People see what they expect to see." Sophia's certainty wavered. The resemblance had been strong, but from a distance, across decades. "You're lying." "Perhaps. Or perhaps you'll publish your story and it will become another conspiracy theory. Another unverified claim that disappears into the noise of the internet." The woman moved toward the door. "The guard change happens in 4 minutes. I suggest you use the water tunnel. Next time we'll have it sealed." She left, closing the door behind her. Sophia stood frozen, her mind reeling. Was it true? Had Müller died months ago? Or was this misdirection a final layer of protection? She grabbed her camera and ran. The tunnel seemed longer on the way back, every shadow a potential threat. She emerged into the cold mountain air, gasping, certain she'd hear alarms or shouts, but there was only silence and the wind through the rocks. Back at camp, she downloaded the photographs, while Marcus and the others peppered her with questions. Hundreds of images, documents, files, photographs, proof of something, even if the truth was now murky. But as she scrolled through the succession protocol documents, one name caught her eye. A name she recognized, not from history books, but from current events. A businessman who'd made headlines recently, donating to political campaigns, funding think tanks. His father was listed in the personnel files. Arrival date 1951. She cross-referenced other names from the succession documents. A European Parliament member, a CEO of a major pharmaceutical company, a federal judge in the United States. The compound wasn't just preserving the past, it was actively shaping the present, and they'd just let her walk away with the evidence. Sophia looked at Marcus. They wanted me to find this. They knew I'd photograph everything. They're not afraid of exposure because no one will believe it, Marcus finished. Or worse, everyone will believe it, and nothing will change. The weight of that realization settled over them. They had the story. They had proof. But in a world drowning in information, scandals, and competing narratives, would anyone care about Nazi fugitives who died decades ago? Or would the real story, the one about their descendants and the networks they'd built, be dismissed as paranoid conspiracy? Sophia stared at the screen, at the faces in those files, and realized the documentary she'd planned to make was no longer the documentary she needed to make. The footage sat on Marcus's laptop like a live grenade. Sophia paced the cramped hotel room in Innsbruck, her mind racing through possibilities. They'd fled the mountains that same night, driving through darkness until they crossed back into Austria. Now, 3 days later, the question wasn't what they'd found. It was what to do with it. We need to verify everything before we publish, Marcus said, scrolling through the photographs for the 100th time. Cross-reference these names against public records, find connections, build an airtight case. Sophia stopped pacing. That will take months, maybe years. And the moment we start making inquiries, they'll know. They'll have time to prepare, to discredit us, to make this disappear. So what's your alternative? Drop it raw on the internet and hope people pay attention? She didn't have an answer. The documentary she'd envisioned, the careful investigation with expert interviews and historical context, felt suddenly naive. That approach assumed the world worked on facts and evidence. But the woman in the compound had understood something Sophia was only beginning to grasp. In the age of information overload, truth wasn't enough. You needed to make people care. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Miss Castellanos. The voice was male, unfamiliar, speaking German with a Bavarian accent. My name is Werner Koch. I believe we have mutual interests. Sophia put the phone on speaker, gesturing for Marcus to listen. Who are you? Someone who knows what you found in that compound. Someone who's been trying to expose these networks for 15 years. How did you get my number? The same way I know you photographed 247 documents, including the succession protocols and the current beneficiary list. You're not the first person to infiltrate that facility, Miss Castellanos. You're just the first one they let walk away with evidence. Marcus leaned toward the phone. Why would they do that? Because they've evolved. The old generation, the ones who actually committed the crimes, they're dying off. The new generation doesn't need to hide anymore. They're protected by legitimacy, by wealth, by the assumption that the past is past. Exposing them now just makes you look like a conspiracy theorist. Sophia felt her stomach tighten. So what do we do? You meet me. Tomorrow. Salzburg. There's a cafe near the Residenzplatz called Tomaselli. Noon. Come alone. I'm not going anywhere alone after what happened in. Bring your cameraman if it makes you feel safer. But understand this. The people you're dealing with don't work through violence anymore. They work through lawyers, public relations firms, and reputation management. They'll destroy your credibility long before they'd risk making you a martyr. The line went dead. Marcus looked at her. This feels like a setup. Everything about this story feels like a setup, but we need allies, people who understand how these networks operate. They drove to Salzburg the next morning, arriving early to scout the location. Café Tomaselli sat in the heart of the old city, an elegant establishment that had been serving coffee since 1705. Public, visible, the kind of place where nothing dramatic could happen without witnesses. Werner Koch was already there when they arrived, a man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent time in uniform. He wore an expensive suit, but carried himself like a soldier. He stood when Sophia approached, shaking her hand with formal precision. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit." They ordered coffee. Koch waited until the server left before speaking. "I was Bundespolizei for 20 years. Organized Crime Division. In 2008, I stumbled onto financial connections between a neo-Nazi group in Munich and a charitable foundation in Liechtenstein. The foundation was funding youth programs, political campaigns, cultural initiatives, all perfectly legal. But when I traced the foundation's origins, I found links to post-war rat lines and laundered Nazi gold." Sophia pulled out her camera. "May I?" Koch nodded. "I tried to investigate through official channels. My superiors shut it down. Too politically sensitive, they said. Too many prominent people involved. I kept digging on my own time and was forced into early retirement. Since then, I've been documenting these networks independently." "Why tell us this?" Marcus asked. "Because you have something I don't. Fresh evidence, current names. The succession protocols you photographed represent 30 years of careful planning. They show how the old guard transferred wealth, connections, and ideology to a new generation. Those people are now in positions of real power." Sophia thought of the names she'd seen. The businessman, the parliament member, the judge. "How do we prove the connection?" Koch pulled a folder from his briefcase. "I've spent 15 years building that proof. Financial records, property transfers, organizational charts. But I'm a retired cop with an agenda. No one takes me seriously. You're a documentary filmmaker. You have credibility, a platform." He slid the folder across the table. Sophia opened it, scanning page after page of meticulous documentation. Bank statements showing money flowing from Swiss accounts to political action committees. Property records linking the Alpine compound to a network of holding companies. Photographs of meetings between people who publicly claimed no connection. "This is incredible," Sophia breathed. "This is everything we need." "To what?" Koch interrupted. "Publish a documentary that gets labeled as conspiracy theory within hours? Miss Castellanos, I've tried exposing this information through every channel imaginable. Journalists, prosecutors, even members of parliament. Nothing changes. Because these people aren't stupid. They've built layers of legitimacy. They donate to the right causes, attend the right galas, have the right friends in media and government." Sophia felt the familiar frustration rising. "Then what's the point? If we can't expose them, if no one will listen, why are we even having this conversation?" Koch smiled for the first time. "I didn't say we can't expose them. I said traditional exposure doesn't work. We need a different approach." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "The succession protocols you photographed include something they didn't mean to preserve. A list of properties and assets that were never properly laundered. Buildings in Argentina purchased with stolen Jewish wealth. Art collections that should be in museums. Gold that was never returned to its rightful owners." Marcus understood first. "You want to go after their money. More than that, I want to force them into the light. File claims with international tribunals. Sue for restitution. Make them defend their inheritance publicly. Once you make it about stolen property and war crimes, the legal protections vanish. Suddenly, they're not successful businessmen and politicians. They're people trying to hold on to Nazi plunder." Sophia considered this. It was elegant, using the system against itself. But it was also dangerous. They'll fight back, with everything they have. Of course they will. But fighting back means admitting the connection. Defending their right to property means acknowledging where it came from. Every legal filing, every court appearance, every deposition becomes part of the public record. They can't make it disappear. The cafe had filled with afternoon tourists. Around them, people sipped coffee and ate Sachertorte, oblivious to the conversation happening at their table. Sophia watched them and thought about the woman in the compound. She'd been so confident, so certain that exposure wouldn't matter, because she'd assumed Sophia would try to fight in the court of public opinion, where truth was negotiable and attention spans were short. But this approach was different. This was bureaucratic warfare, the kind that ground on for years, that created permanent records and legal precedents. The kind these networks couldn't control through public relations. "I need to think about this," Sophia said. Koch nodded. "Of course, but understand, the moment you publish anything about that compound, they'll move to protect themselves. Windows close quickly in this business. If we're going to do this, we need to move before they realize what we're planning." He stood, leaving cash on the table for the coffee. "You have my number. Call me when you decide." After he left, Sophia and Marcus sat in silence. The weight of the decision pressed down on them. This wasn't the documentary she'd planned. This was something bigger, messier, potentially more dangerous. But it was also the only path that might actually work. Marcus spoke first. "If we do this, there's no going back. We're committing to years of legal battles, personal attacks, probably worse. I know. And we might lose. They have resources we can't match. I know that too." He looked at her. "So why do I get the feeling you've already decided?" Sophia thought about the files, the photographs, the names of people who'd inherited blood money and turned it into power. She thought about the woman in the compound, so confident in her invulnerability. And she thought about Werner Koch, spending 15 years alone, trying to expose a truth no one wanted to hear. "Because some stories don't end when you stop filming," she said. The decision came easier than Sophia expected. Maybe because she'd already made it the moment she walked out of that compound alive. Maybe because Werner Koch had shown her what 15 years of isolation looked like, and she knew she couldn't live with that kind of silence. She called Koch the next morning. 3 weeks later, the first legal filings hit courts in Geneva, Buenos Aires, and New York simultaneously. Not lawsuits yet. Just preliminary claims, requests for documentation, formal notifications that certain properties and assets were being investigated for potential ties to looted Nazi wealth. Boring bureaucratic language that most news outlets ignored completely. But the networks noticed. Sophia's phone started ringing within hours. Unknown numbers, all of which she let go to voicemail. Then came the emails. Legal threats mostly, but also offers, substantial ones. Money to make this go away, opportunities to direct other films, consulting positions that would pay more than she'd make in a lifetime of documentaries. She deleted them all. Marcus handled the media strategy, which mostly meant having no media strategy, no press releases, no interviews, no dramatic announcements. Just quiet, persistent legal work that created paper trails and official records. The kind of work that couldn't be disappeared with a phone call or a payoff. Koch had been right about one thing. Fighting back meant acknowledging the connection. Within 2 months, lawyers representing various families and corporations started filing motions to dismiss. Each motion had to explain why their clients weren't liable, which meant admitting relationships, confirming property ownership, establishing timelines. Every filing was a small victory, another piece of documentation that couldn't be erased. The first real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A junior researcher at a museum in Munich contacted Sophia through an encrypted email. She'd seen the legal filings and recognized some of the artwork mentioned. Pieces that had passed through her institution's authentication process years ago, certified as legitimately acquired, but she'd always had doubts. The provenance documentation was perfect, she wrote. Too perfect. Like someone had gone back and created a complete paper trail decades after the fact. I raised concerns, but I was told the family's lawyers had verified everything. Now, I'm wondering what else I missed. She provided copies of internal emails, authentication reports, and photographs of pieces that had never been publicly displayed. More importantly, she provided names of other museum staff who'd had similar concerns over the years. people who'd been quietly pushed out or convinced to drop their questions. Sophia added it all to the growing archive. By month 4, the legal proceedings had attracted attention from international human rights organizations. Groups that specialized in Holocaust restitution saw an opportunity to set precedents, to establish that inherited Nazi wealth could be challenged regardless of how many generations had passed. They brought resources Sophia and Co. couldn't match. Teams of lawyers, researchers with access to archives across Europe, forensic accountants who could trace money through decades of corporate shell games. The networks started making mistakes. Pressure creates cracks, and these families weren't used to sustained legal scrutiny. A lawyer in Buenos Aires filed a motion that contradicted testimony given by the same family in a Swiss proceeding. A corporate representative claimed ignorance of certain property acquisitions that appeared in documents the company itself had submitted months earlier. Small inconsistencies, but they added up. Then came the defection. His name was Thomas Reichert, grandson of one of the compound's founding families. He'd grown up knowing the truth, raised to see it as a source of pride rather than shame. But he'd also been watching the legal proceedings, seeing the documentation pile up, reading the testimonies. Something had shifted. He contacted Sophia through Koch, insisting on a face-to-face meeting. They arranged it in Prague, neutral territory, in a hotel conference room rented under a false name. Reichert was 38, impeccably dressed, carrying himself with the casual confidence of inherited wealth. But his hands shook slightly as he opened his briefcase. "I'm not doing this out of guilt," he said immediately. "I want that clear. I'm doing this because they're going to lose anyway, and I'd rather be on the right side when it happens. Practical rather than moral." Sophia could work with that. What he brought was devastating. Internal family documents going back to the 1950s showing exactly how looted assets had been converted into legitimate businesses. Names, dates, amounts. The kind of detailed record-keeping that Germans were famous for applied to laundering Nazi plunder. "Why did they keep all this?" Marcus asked. Reichert smiled without humor. "Insurance. If one family tried to take more than their share, the others could prove exactly what everyone had started with. Mutually assured documentation." He also brought something else. Video recordings from recent family gatherings where the older generation discussed strategy for dealing with the legal challenges. Casual conversations where they talked about bribing judges, threatening witnesses, using political connections to make problems disappear. Evidence of ongoing criminal conspiracy, not just historical crimes. "They'll know it was me," Reichert said as he handed over the last flash drive. "I'm prepared for that, but I want witness protection guarantees, and I want immunity from prosecution." Koch had already arranged both. The new evidence changed everything. What had started as civil proceedings expanded into criminal investigations. Prosecutors in 3 countries opened cases not just into historical looting but into contemporary obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and fraud. The networks couldn't make it all go away. The machinery of international law had started grinding, slow but inexorable. 6 months after the first filings, Sophia finally published the documentary. Not the one she'd originally planned, but something more comprehensive. A chronicle of the investigation itself, showing how systems of power perpetuate themselves across generations. It premiered at a small film festival in Berlin. No major streaming platform would touch it, but that didn't matter. The legal proceedings had created enough public interest that independent theaters picked it up. Then universities started showing it. Then it appeared online, copied and shared faster than anyone could take it down. The woman from the compound never contacted Sophia directly, but her lawyers did, multiple times, with increasingly desperate settlement offers. Sophia ignored them all. Some of the families started negotiating with prosecutors, offering to return certain assets in exchange for reduced charges. Others dug in, preparing for trials that would take years to complete. Werner Koch lived to see the first convictions. A German court found 3 defendants guilty of fraud and falsifying provenance documentation. The sentences were light, mostly probation, but the precedent mattered. For the first time, someone had been held criminally accountable for profiting from laundered Nazi wealth. Koch died 2 months later, quietly, in his Vienna apartment. Sophia spoke at his funeral, to a crowd of maybe 20 people. Most were lawyers and researchers who'd worked on the cases. His family had disowned him decades ago. He spent 15 years alone, Sophia told them, because he understood something most of us don't want to face. That evil doesn't end when the evil people die. It transforms, adapts, becomes respectable. Fighting it means accepting that you won't see victory in your lifetime. Werner made that choice. We're all here because he did. The legal battles continued. Appeals, new filings, investigations expanding into other networks and other families. Sophia had been right when she told Marcus there was no going back. This was her life now, probably for decades. But some stories don't end when you stop filming. Some stories become something bigger than documentation. They become accountability, slow and imperfect, but real. Late one night, working through another box of documents in her Berlin apartment, Sophia found a photograph she'd missed before. The compound, taken from above, showing the full scope of the property. Gardens, buildings, the whole elaborate infrastructure of inherited secrecy. She pinned it to her wall, next to maps and timelines and legal filings, a reminder of where this had started, of the woman who'd been so certain that exposure wouldn't matter. She'd been wrong about that. Not because public outrage had destroyed them, public outrage never lasted long enough, but because Sophia had found a different approach. Bureaucratic, tedious, unglamorous. The kind of work that didn't make for good television, but could actually change things. Her phone buzzed. Another encrypted message from another museum researcher with doubts about another authentication, another thread to pull. Sophia opened her laptop and started typing. The work continued. It always would. But now she knew that mattered more than any documentary ever could. The compound still stands in those Argentine mountains. Satellite imagery shows the buildings deteriorating now, solar panels dark, gardens overgrown. The trust that maintained it ran out of money 2 years ago, drained by legal fees and asset seizures. Sometimes Sophia thinks about going back, documenting what it looks like now, empty and reclaimed by the forest. But she knows that's not the real story anymore. The real story is in courtrooms and archives. In the museum, researcher who finally got her institution to review its authentication processes. In the prosecutor in Buenos Aires who built her career on cases everyone said were impossible to prove. In Thomas Reichert, living under a new name in Canada, sleeping better than he did when he was protecting secrets. The networks didn't collapse, they never do. But they fractured, weakened, became something their founders wouldn't recognize. The next generation is walking away, calculating that legitimacy costs less than the inheritance is worth. Sophia still gets threats sometimes, legal ones mostly, occasionally worse. She's learned to live with it. The alternative is living with silence, and she knows what that looks like now. She saw it in Werner Koch's apartment, in 15 years of solitary work that almost no one acknowledged. Some battles don't end, they just transform into different battles, fought by different people using whatever tools they can find. Sophia found hers in legal filings, and patience, and the understanding that justice moves slowly when it moves at all. But it moves. This case was brutal. But this case on the right-hand side is even more insane.